Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to Conservation International's People Need Nature discussion series. We're so delighted to have you with us today for an exclusive look behind the scenes at a very important event, which is this year's New York Climate Week. And we have Shaila Raghav, who is Conservation International's Vice President for Climate Change, joining us today to discuss. My name is Rachel Golden Kroner. I am Conservation International's Environmental Governance Fellow. I'm a scientist. I study all the different types of ways that people can best protect and manage natural areas. I look at some of the threats facing these systems, and I look at how they've changed over time. And I think fundamentally my work is motivated by the curiosity about and love for the natural world, concern about humanity's relationship with nature, but also I think informed optimism about our ability to scale up and implement really effective conservation efforts that can help protect the planet and of course protect ourselves. So before we bring in Shaila, I'll just cover a few housekeeping items for this virtual event. So upon joining today, all attendees will be muted automatically and your webcam will be turned off for the duration of the event. If you do have questions, we will have some time at the end for a question and answer session. So you can enter your questions in the question box, which is a drop down under the GoToWebinar control panel. And our team behind the scenes will be moderating your submissions. If you'd like to maximize your video screen, you can do that by clicking the screen expander in the right-hand corner. And finally, today, we're going to be recording the broadcast, and we'll put the video on Conservation International's website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shaila Raghav, who is Conservation International's Vice President of Climate Change. Shaila has attended nearly a decade of United Nations climate change negotiations. She leads Conservation International's climate strategy, and she works closely with partners on innovation and research, demonstration projects, and amplification to bring nature-based solutions for climate change to scale. So welcome, Shaila. It's great to be here with you today.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you.
Great. So the way this will go is I'll start us off with some questions. We'll get into a conversation, and then we'll take the question and answer from the audience. So for the first question, kind of a big picture to start. Before we dive into the topic of today of Climate Week, let's just think about, big picture. So 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature. We heard that term a lot. Can you tell us more about what that means? What was the super year supposed to be? And then how has the pandemic affected those expectations?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rachel, for that question. And first, let me say I really liked the phrase that you used, informed optimism. Once someone called me insanely optimistic, but I think I like informed optimism a lot better. So you're absolutely right. I think in the run-up to 2020, the branding for the year really was super year because it was really this culmination point of the climate and biodiversity and sustainable development agenda. So the Paris Agreement entered into force this year. The Convention on Biological Diversity is negotiating its revised biodiversity targets, which previously were the Aichi targets, and then Sustainable Development Goals are also kind of having a refresh moment. And so it was really kind of thought to be this important inflection point, this important moment in time where all of the domains and the political decisions around how natural resources are used and how humanity relates to nature were going to be decided kind of in a big, concerted, coordinated way. But of course, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed our trajectory for action. Almost every single political moment and all of the consultations that preceded those political moments have been delayed. And so I think we're really left at this point in time with a choice. Do we worry and do we despair, or do we actually think about how we can leverage the opportunities in front of us? I mean, personally, I've seen this pivot or a shift to more localized responses to climate change. I've seen a lot more of an intention to embed and intersect issues like justice or even the economy and jobs and human health with climate change. So I actually see a tremendous amount of opportunity in downscaling our approach and personalizing our approaches to climate change and then leveraging that personal enlightened consciousness into the collective through those political moments that we see coming in the next weeks, months, and years.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And I think perhaps the pandemic has forced us to do that internal reflection on, because we're in our homes. So we have this space and this time to really reflect and think about those local opportunities. So now thinking about Climate Week, we have this event coming up this year. Can you tell us just generally what is this Climate Week event? Why is it something that we care about? And what are some of the past accomplishments of prior Climate Weeks?
Yeah, so even just looking within the past few years that I've worked on climate change, I've seen a significant evolution in how climate weeks are really leveraged to create and galvanize the type of action that we need for strong political action. So if we go back to 2015, that was the year when the Paris Agreement was actually adopted and when it was negotiated. So the year prior to that agreement, to the Paris climate talks, in 2014, the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon actually convened a climate summit with the intention of bringing together what we call, in kind of policy terms, non-state actors. So those are essentially private sector companies, investors, civil society, community organizations, faith leaders, to kind of bring them and incorporate them into discussions around climate change for a very important and strategic purpose. And that purpose was to give political leaders the confidence, but also the mandate. So for a head of state to see, look at all of these business leaders that are demanding action on climate change, and not only demanding action, but actually stepping up with their own commitments. Those types of statements and acknowledgments from the private sector really, I think, had an instrumental effect and impact, giving heads of state a clear kind of pathway to agree to the Paris Agreement in 2015. So very similarly, every year, New York Climate Week, which usually takes place in parallel with the United Nations General Assembly, so it normally is around September every year, precedes a big political meeting with that objective, to in some way galvanize or bring non-state actors together with governments to really kind of build momentum and the kind of business case and the incentive for action on the part of these big political moments. And so over the last few years, we've also seen the types of thematic focus of these weeks shift over time. When I started working on climate change, almost every discussion on climate change focused just on energy or on fossil fuels, which, don't get me wrong, are a really important part of the climate solution. But part of what we do at Conservation International is try to embed and inject a recognition of the importance of nature as the climate solution. And in fact, last year in 2019, more than 1/3 of all of the events at New York Climate Week were focused on nature. So it really, I think, has reflected an evolution and more recognition and awareness of the range of types of solutions and the types of stakeholders and actors that need to be part of those conversations.
That's great. And seems like there's a parallel here. The 1/3 of events at last year's Climate Week sounds familiar, right? That we know that 1/3 of the solutions to climate change come from nature, right? So yeah, that's a nice parallel.
Yeah, and I think it signals that the conversation is reaching parity with the importance of solution. And I think that was really encouraging for us, and I think probably one of the biggest accomplishments for Conservation International and all of our partners around the world, is to be able to show up at these events with the confidence and with the recognition on the part of the broader climate community that the solutions in nature are real, and that they're investment ready, and that they can actually deliver real results on the ground.
That's great. It's great perspective on the past. So now thinking about this year's Climate Week, it's obviously very different. We're all in our homes, we're all virtual. So what do you think some of the unique challenges or opportunities that this format may present, and how has the event evolved to meet this moment today?
Absolutely. So I think with everything going virtual, I think it offers kind of some opportunities or advantages, because with everything being virtual, you're almost democratizing it, because you're opening kind of the opportunities for folks to participate, because you basically just need internet access. You don't actually need to physically fly to New York to speak at an event. However, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge that not every place in the world has access to internet. So even so, it's not kind of a given that by shifting to virtual, we will actually have better representation. But also, I think there's a lot of kind of virtual fatigue. You know, I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for you as well, Rachel. I mean, almost all of our meetings, all of our work, and all of our engagement has shifted virtual. So I think there's a little bit of a hesitation or a frustration with having to be looking at a screen all the time, and there's really no substitute for that interpersonal connection that you might have with someone in the margins of a meeting or the margins of a conference. So I think there are some advantages, but there are some drawbacks as well, or challenges that we've been navigating and trying to work through in planning our events. And so ultimately, I think what we're really focusing on is kind of really paring down our program to be really targeted and specific. So rather than kind of being in every meeting at every time, really thinking about strategically who are the key folks that need a seat at the table, that we can use our network to kind of amplify the voices of communities that we work with. What are the main messages, and who are the audiences that we need to deliver those messages to? So if we can be more targeted and focused, I think that it'll ensure that our virtual engagements will actually kind of have their intended outcome and benefit, which is ultimately to elevate the successes of natural climate solutions, uplifting the voices of marginalized and vulnerable communities, and ultimately sending a very clear signal to political leaders that even though they're not convening and kind of adopting new targets for either climate or biodiversity this year, that there is action, that there is momentum, and that there is a demand on the part of the citizenry and on the part of communities to show up next year with not just a kind of an incremental solution to biodiversity and climate, but showing up next year with something that really leverages and accelerates and propels our work beyond that which we could have achieved in 2020 alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely feel that increased sense of urgency in general as well with the pandemic and some of the lessons that we're learning that, where did this pandemic come from? It's a zoonotic disease from an animal. And as we continue to deforest and cut down and fragment forests, that increases the conditions for emergence of future zoonoses. So do you think that has increased the sense of urgency this year?
Absolutely. I think it's increased the sense of urgency, but not only that, I think we've seen unprecedented climate change impacts over the last few months, but even in the span of a couple of years. So with the kind of unprecedented historic fires in Australia, in Brazil, but even in my home state in California, it's really been shocking. And I think it's been a wake-up call. I think we've seen a shock to the system in more ways than one, not just COVID and a global pandemic and kind of shifting and altering our entire daily routine, but also recognizing that climate change is here. It's now. It's not an issue that we're trying to prevent in the future. And I think this recognition is becoming internalized, and actually I think it being embedded into the consciousness of people in a way that is motivating and compelling the types of questions, but also the type of serious deliberation and reflection on what we need to be doing about it collectively as individuals, but also as humanity.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's a lot of issues converging. What do you think some of the priorities for Conservation International's strategy this year are going into Climate Week, and what do you think success looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I would say the biggest political moment, even though all of the big decisions are through 2021, is going to be a UN Biodiversity Summit that's taking place on September 30th. So it will feature statements on the part of heads of state. And I think that one big objective or one big priority that we have as an institution is really ensuring that the biodiversity issue and the climate issue are not siloed, that they're not kept separate, because I think what we've learned is that fundamentally they're linked. If we destroy nature, we're limiting our resilience and our opportunity to mitigate the causes of climate change, and we're actually making ourselves more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I think that that the presence of this summit, or the kind of the occurrence of this summit, really motivates and compels an integration between those two issues, climate change and biodiversity, so that we emerge out of this week with a shared vision and a shared sense of how those two are kind of integrated, rather than two very different sets of targets. The second thing I would say is quite a big priority of ours is radical collaboration. It's just this recognition that we can't solve this crisis alone, and that it really will require and compel the involvement of local communities, of all of our peer and partner organizations around the world, and governments with whom we work in the 30 countries in which we have a presence. So this concept of radical collaboration, I think, is really coming to the fore through some events that we're hosting called the Nature for Life Hub. That is a 4-day virtual hub, and we'll have information about that on our website for anyone who's interested in tuning in and registering for some of those events. But really, we'll be working together with the UN Development Program, with organizations like the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund, to really kind of bring together a collective vision on how our community can really support green recovery and green economies underpinned by a recognition of the value of nature.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So kind of taking a bit of a pivot here, but I think one thing that this year has taught us is that all of these different crises are connected. So there's been a lot of tragic events this past summer in the United States and the US and the world really reckoning with environmental justice and race issues. So a lot of people, I think, maybe are coming to these conversations with this in mind and thinking about this sense of urgency around environmental justice. So how have you been thinking about this, and what are some of the ways that you see global climate policy responding and addressing simultaneously environmental justice and social injustices?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rachel. I think that there's probably no more important question than that one, especially for those of us that are living in the United States and really reckoning with a conflicting past and precedents of how people of color and Indigenous communities in particular in this country have been treated, and how that's actually influenced and impacted our approach to conservation. So I think that in particular this year, an important theme and element of our conversations in Climate Week are going to be focused on really uplifting the role of local communities, Indigenous communities, and people of color as kind of stewards, but also solutions providers. I think oftentimes we uplift and celebrate the work of corporations or even of donors as being the savior, right? As the ones that are bringing in the dollars, the cash, and therefore making these solutions possible. I think that we need to acknowledge and recognize that a lot of traditional practices, Indigenous practices of tending and stewarding land, are in and of themselves nature-based solutions. So I think we really need to reframe these issues rather than seeing it as a solution that governments or corporations or big development banks are solving. It's rather those resources are in service of a way of managing land and of relating to the land that allows Indigenous people to have the right and the resources to actually realize the potential of the human land relationship. So I think that reframing and that reorientation of our work is so critically important, because I think it helps position people of color and Indigenous communities, helps give them, or at least recognizes the inherent power that they have, rather than kind of framing it as them being given the power that they probably didn't already have. The second thing I would say is, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about this kind of personal, the way that COVID has forced us to reflect on a more personal level. And what I really like to think about is what kind of change can we stimulate or can we trigger, not in spite of COVID, but because of COVID? What are the opportunities that we have to slow down, that will allow us to break away from the incrementalism that we were stuck to previously. I mean, even I felt this frustration that prior to COVID, we were just kind of in this cycle of going to conferences, going to meetings, and each time accepting a very substandard and incremental response to global issues like climate change and biodiversity. So I really would like us to all see COVID as an opportunity to connect more deeply with one another, to connect more deeply with ourselves at an individual level, and what kind of future we want to co-create with our communities. How can we revisit and reinvent those responses to all of those challenges that we're seeing today? Because ultimately, like you said, the solutions are the same. If we address structural and systemic racism, we also are addressing climate change. If we're addressing biodiversity loss, we're also addressing climate change. Really, the solutions to all of these problems are rooted at the individual level, and really, I think, will stem from that same recognition and consciousness. So I think this time of reckoning on environmental justice issues is motivating, forcing, compelling, and I think giving us the opportunity to develop and ultimately scale a more sustainable, durable solution to all of these crises.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And just reflecting on what you just said, so thinking about, the literature, there's plenty of evidence to show the effectiveness of indigenous people's lands with rights secured, for example, in the Amazon. Those lands are really effective at reducing deforestation, equal to or better than the national parks and other protected areas. So, we can see it from satellites. There's clear evidence to show the value of the stewardship that's been going on for generations. And then just another thing, I heard a phrase recently that was really compelling. So there's a lot of talk about building back better. Someone suggested that, well, we shouldn't be building back to what we were doing before. We should be building forward. So I thought that was informative to think that we can actually open up and think in different ways because of this moment, because of COVID, because of our reckonings with structural racism and all of these issues. It's a moment that we can pause and kind of think about things in perhaps a different way than we had before.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I don't think we need to accept a future that resembles the past. And I think this break, this pause, this complete upheaval of our lives is the right moment to actually ask those questions of ourselves and one another, and then ultimately not necessarily resign ourselves to going back to the way that we were before, buying the same things, defining success through material consumption, just kind of being on a constant treadmill of kind of meeting after meeting, right? Maybe there's a different way of living. Maybe there's a different way of being.
Absolutely. And I think it also speaks to the value of traditional knowledge. And this is something I had totally no idea about until quite recently when I've started to read about this and how powerful it is. I'm a scientist from like a Western scientific tradition, but it's quite amazing to see, how traditional knowledge can work and the connection of people to the land and that intergenerational and that reciprocity and these concepts that I think if we all embraced on an individual and sort of societal level, I think would go a long way toward helping us multi-solve, solve some of these different issues all together at once.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's not only just downscaling these global issues to the national or to the corporate level, it's also to the individual level. Because ultimately the institutions and the structures that we create, whether it be governments or kind of other types of societal interaction, is a reflection of our collective individual consciousness. So the way that we can actually change these global institutions is really starts at the individual level, and I know that can be a really difficult concept to come across, and then I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't hold governments and we shouldn't hold companies accountable for their actions, because they very much are. The individuals in those companies need to be accountable for how they're reflecting on this moment as well.
Absolutely. I think it's both, right? It's everything. And there is some evidence also to show that there's a spillover effect. So if I change my behavior, if I start composting, or if I start doing something or stop doing something else, other people will see that and then adopt those behaviors into their lifestyles, and then it can ripple out. So
It's a contagion
yeah,
behavior.
viral in a good way this time. Yeah. So along the similar lines of COVID and the pandemic and themes that have kind of come up this year, one thing that really strikes me is I think the pandemic has shown us the importance of evidence, scientific evidence, communicating that evidence to the public, evidence-based policies. Do you think there's anything we can learn from this COVID science communication experience as related to climate and nature?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I think in the beginning, I was really confident that people were listening to the science, that they were washing their hands, that they were wearing masks. Of course, I think there's still rampant misinformation that I think is rejecting the science or not believing the science. Again, I'm not sure how one cannot believe scientific fact, but I think it's really a matter of packaging the information in the right way and not demonizing or vilifying a community or a type of people, but rather I think communicating in a way that makes it personal, that relates kind of these global realities or global facts, but making it something that is understandable and experienced by someone on an individual level. So I like to use a lot of analogies. I talk about how you buy car insurance. You probably don't like spending the money to buy car insurance, but you do because in the event that you have an accident, then you're covered. So it's the same thing with climate change. You may not like having to pay a little bit extra in the short term, but in the long run, you're better off, and everybody else is better off as well. The other thing, another analogy that I really like to use is in terms of, people oftentimes talk about, there might be some scientists that don't agree with climate findings or climate science. But if you if you're driving a car and you're about to go across a bridge and they tell you that 97% of structural engineers tell you that that bridge is going to fall down, will you drive over it, or are you going to believe the 3%? So I think using analogies and kind of bringing it to a personal level can really help communicate the importance and the reasoning why a person may want to kind of take some of these recommendations on board or kind of internalize them in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this overall experience of 2020 pandemic science communication has shown, I think, first of all, just the value of science and the importance of expertise and that clear communication with the public. There's also this lesson we can learn about, like, what is science and how does it work? Science is a process, right? It's not a body of facts that we just pull from. It took some time to figure out, what is this virus? Where might it have come from? How might it spread? What do we do about it? And some folks were looking at that and saying, well, scientists keep changing their minds and they keep changing their message, but it takes time, and this is a new thing, and it took some time to study what was going on and move forward. So I think we could all, learn basically science is a process. It's not just a fixed state. Yeah, I think that's something I've tried to articulate, at least in my community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The whole point of science being a process is so important, especially because I think oftentimes people want just very black and white recommendations, and we're basically in a position where there's a significant amount of uncertainty, right? Can anyone tell you with precision, how intense is the storm next year in the hurricane season going to be, or how bad will the fires be? Probably not. We can give you a range of probabilities, and I'm sure you can do the same in terms of pandemics or even in terms of protected areas, but we can't predict with precision. It's a matter of, I think, rather thinking about preparedness and thinking about, making decisions with incomplete information, but in an informed way, right? So kind of like your optimism, taking that information into account, recognizing that we're managing risk at any given point in time. We're managing so many types of risk, whether it's, car accidents or even just your own health, but it's a matter of us thinking about how do we take all of those data points and make use of that information in our decisions rather than kind of rejecting science as a monolith.
Absolutely. And I think what's also really fascinating is that there's been so much science, so much research coming out in the last 6 months around all kinds of issues associated with COVID, like everything and COVID. How does COVID affect all of these things? So I've been looking into like, how is COVID going to affect protected and conserved areas? What are the threats that are emerging? What are some of the responses we can think about moving forward? There's been some great research by other scientists at Conservation International. One really fundamental message from a recent paper that came out in Science looked at the cost of dealing with the pandemic this year, trillions of dollars in economic impact and loss of lives, versus how much would it cost to prevent a pandemic through reducing deforestation, addressing wildlife trade, and so forth. And it was 2%, something just so minuscule to actually prevent a future pandemic rather than, react and spend way more to deal with it in real time.
Yeah, and that's so important. I think maybe we just need to be better about how do you communicate this kind of ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of concept, because it's the exact same thing in climate change. But I think it's a lot harder to communicate or even incentivize when you have to put in resources to make things less bad in the future rather than to fix them after the fact. And that's why I really like using this insurance analogy, because I think to me that's the clearest example of when a person may be motivated to kind of spend some cash in the near term, in the short term, to prevent a damage or a harm in the future.
Absolutely. So I have one last question, and then we'll start moving into our Q&A. So if you do have any questions at this point, feel free to enter them into the chat. Okay, so for our last question here, basically, big question, as Climate Week is happening, governments are starting to put together these economic recovery packages. And we've touched on this, I think, a little bit, but how do you think that these economic recovery plans can help address not only economic recovery in the social and economic sense, but also start to address climate change and nature loss?
Yeah, so this is such an incredible opportunity because it's literally trillions of dollars that are going to be deployed to support communities, to support individuals who may have lost their jobs or may need kind of training, or we may actually need to think about restructuring an entire economy in light of kind of the long-lasting effects of COVID, which has hit certain industries more than others. And I think that rather than kind of like we were talking about earlier, is just building back to a previous state that may have not been serving the well-being or the outcomes that I think all of us desire, which is justice, which is equity, which is kind of a harmonious relationship with one another and with the planet. I think that we were on a pathway and a trajectory that was taking us further away from that end state or that future where we kind of reduce conflict, we reduce this kind of conflict over resources, or reduce the kind of economic outlook or prospect for so many communities around the world. So I really think it's so critical that the recovery dollars go into kind of green training or kind of vocational training for green jobs, or investing in kind of the industries of the future that will actually put us on track towards a more climate resilient development pathway that is also compatible with reversing the loss of biodiversity. So investing in the protection and restoration of land. I mean, restoration can also be a really important activity that governments can invest in, because it's an active activity. It can employ people to go and kind of bring life back to the land through planting efforts, or through kind of other ways of managing working lands or forests or even farms. So I think that there's a lot of kind of very simple solutions that governments can take in making sure that we're safeguarding and securing our economic development opportunities, but also preventing the risk of pandemics and preventing the risk of catastrophic climate change in the future as well.
Absolutely, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier too about prevention. We can bring that in now, so that in 5 to 10 years we're not having to spend again trillions of dollars in response to a future pandemic, but by protecting and restoring lands and ecosystems, employing individuals. Having zoonoses monitoring programs is another thing that's been suggested to try to get a handle on the emergence of zoonotic diseases. All of these can kind of come together and try to multi-solve. It's a word I keep using to address these issues simultaneously. So
yeah, and it's interesting because I think we can just look at it from the perspective of where we spend our dollars are the industries and the types of structures that are going to persist. So if we just think about that, whichever companies that we're buying more from right now, or the types of businesses that we are patrons of right now, are the ones that are going to survive the pandemic. So in the very same way, where we deploy these dollars is going to define the future that we'll have. So it's really important that we're very thoughtful and that we hold our governments accountable to thoughtfully and responsibly deploy those resources.
Absolutely. And I think this can also bring in the question, the conversation about rights and Indigenous and local community stewardship, and like all of this can kind of come together. So, great. So we're going to move into the question and answer portion. We have a couple of questions already. So let's see. The first question is, I think, a great one for everyone in the audience. Basically, how can the public get involved? How can people get involved in the Climate Week conversations, and also just general policy debates on climate change? Any calls to action you might recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, since everything is virtual, a lot of these events are open to the public. So I know that there's probably hundreds of events and it might get overwhelming, but I would really encourage looking at the calendar of events. There's a really robust calendar on the Climate Group's website. They're the kind of official convener of Climate Week, but we also will have on our website a calendar of Conservation International's events. So I would really encourage you to tune in just so you can get a sense of how these conversations are evolving, but also the individuals and the organizations whose voices we can uplift and whose work we can support through our voice or through spreading the word, or whatever way you might be able to in your community. So that's just one very simple thing. The other piece I would say is keep talking about climate change, keep talking about biodiversity, because everyone is COVID is so top of mind and it's completely changed our lives. But I think that, the narrative around climate change is always surrounded by this despair and doom and gloom. But I really think we need to activate a different part of our brain. We need to see this as kind of a response from kind of a call to action from our planet, telling us something that something's wrong. So rather than kind of putting it out of our mind or kind of being paralyzed to not act, I think we need to keep talking about it, even if it's difficult or we don't have all the answers. Let's keep it in our collective consciousness and let's keep raising these issues, because it's going to ensure that climate change becomes a voting issue in the election this year, and it'll make sure that all of our business leaders and even local leaders will be held accountable to and recognize that as they're making decisions on a day-to-day basis, that their citizenry, that their constituents care about climate change, and it will kind of have this broader spillover effect if we do that.
Absolutely. And just adding on to that as well, I think one of the most important things that every single individual can do is just stay informed of those super local issues in your immediate neighborhood that you can get involved in. There might be public hearings and opportunities to write letters to the editor. There's a lot of different things that everyone can do. And I think coming from that local perspective is just that much more powerful. And it doesn't matter how old you are. You can be very young, and that's even more powerful in some cases. That the youth voice is just incredibly important. So yeah, there's a lot we can do. We have another question from one of our audience members. So they ask, you mentioned not demonizing a community by making them feel bad about their role in climate change. How can this kind of thinking be applied to larger companies for further buy-in to environmental causes?
Absolutely. So I think in terms of, I think we shouldn't be demonizing certain communities and singling them out, because I don't necessarily think that shame is a motivator. I think that visions and big ideas are much more powerful. I mean, of course, you can point to specific campaigns, kind of boycott campaigns that have have actually moved the needle and shifted public discourse. But I think on a systemic level, it's the big visions, it's the big ideas, it's the ambitions and aspirations that really motivate and compel the systemic kind of long-standing types of shifts. But that said, I don't think that we shouldn't be holding companies accountable for their actions. And I think that the way that we do that is exercise our power as consumers, exercise our power as shareholders, and recognize that we can actually demand those types of changes and hold them accountable through certain ways, but also acknowledging that there are very specific steps that these companies need to take in order to be on a net zero pathway, whether it's kind of agreeing to a science-based target. That's one pathway, or making zero deforestation commitments. These are some of the types of resolutions or commitments or standards that I think we as individuals and consumers can and should demand and require of companies that we buy things from and that we ultimately are supporting with our dollars.
Absolutely. We have another question that's quite similar, but perhaps a little bit different. So from Peggy, how do we accelerate the awareness of government, finance, and private company leaders to make decisions to reverse the loss of biodiversity, redesign economic systems, and bring action to nature-based solutions? So similar, but perhaps a bit different.
Yeah, perhaps a bit different. I think that one of the outcomes of New York Climate Week this year, I think, is also this kind of convergence of these platforms that are organizing corporate or non-state action on climate change. So I'll point to just a couple. One is the Race to Zero. So this is an effort that is being championed by the high-level champions for COP26, which is taking place in the UK next year. The COP is the Conference of the Parties that addresses climate change. They basically negotiated the Paris Agreement and its update and implementation over time. So under that process, they have this platform called Race to Zero. And this is the platform through which companies can kind of signal their intent to race their emissions to zero and actually put the company on a pathway to put in place the green practices. And I think it's really led to this movement where it's almost been like a race to the top, where companies are trying to show that they're leaders on sustainability and that they are actually part of a climate solution. And I think it's getting to that point where consumers are demanding that companies are also held accountable, and it's through these types of platforms that they're encouraged and that they have kind of the methodologies and the standards that they can employ in their own practices to put them on that right pathway.
Great. We have one more question, and then we'll probably wrap up. Okay, so from Jeff, thank you both for the informed optimism. Not easy to find these days. I really like the bridge analogy that Shyla shared. Okay, he asked, what resources can you share for guidance when discussing with people who might not be as well informed about these topics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Conservation International's website has a lot of videos. We've been convening these speaker series to kind of highlight new science and different perspectives on how we communicate that science to the broader public. We've kind of also thought about kind of different voices and bringing in different voices like Indigenous leaders. So I would really encourage folks to follow the People Need Nature series and see what other interesting content there might be there. But then also our climate webpage includes our kind of position and our strategy on climate change, which kind of defines all of the science and makes the case for not only a environmental case, but also an economic case for why governments and individuals and companies may want to invest in nature. So I would recommend that one, but I would also recommend there's this report called The New Nature Economy, and it was supported by the World Economic Forum that I think has a lot of really great data points and information. There's also reports on what's being called the nature positive recovery that includes a lot of data and information that can be utilized in conversations, but also to kind of learn more about what are the actual evidence points behind all of these ideas that we've shared today.
Absolutely. And I'll just add, I think there's a lot of information out there. It really depends on what you're looking for. You know, if you're into TED Talks, if you're on social media, there's plenty of content related to kind of breaking down some of these topics in more detail if you're just getting started with these issues. So one last comment. Oh yeah, so we will share the climate change landing page as a resource in the follow-up email, just to note that. Great, so it looks like we're just at about time. Thank you everyone for joining us. This was a joy of a conversation for me. And thanks so much, Shiloh, for your time today. And thanks everyone for your questions. So we'll be following up with an email that includes a link to a recording of the session, as well as the link to that website, as well as a survey. So please send us your feedback. And feel free to share this recording with your family and friends. So yeah, thanks everyone for your time, and be well, stay safe, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Rachel. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.